In the heart of a crumbling city, where broken streetlights flickered and graffiti painted the walls, Max Simmons worked quietly in his small garage. He was a broad-shouldered man with dark skin, calloused hands, and a quiet demeanor. People in the neighborhood knew him as the guy who fixed cars and minded his own business. He never raised his voice, never got involved in trouble, and always kept his head low. But in a neighborhood ruled by fear, where gangs roamed the streets like wolves, staying invisible was hard. One cold evening, Max was in his garage, tightening the bolts on a rusty old truck. The smell of oil filled the air as the hum of his tools echoed softly. He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, his thick arms glistening with sweat. The sound of laughter and loud voices outside caught his attention. It was Razor and his crew. Razor was a tall, lean man with a sharp face and an attitude that screamed danger. He led a gang that terrorized the neighborhood, extorting money from shopkeepers, harassing residents, and punishing anyone who dared to defy them. His men followed him like loyal dogs, feeding off his arrogance and cruelty. Max sighed and kept working. He'd seen them around before, but they had never bothered him. He preferred it that way. "Hey, big guy," a voice called out from outside the garage. Max didn't respond. He tightened another bolt, pretending he hadn't heard. "Hey, I'm talking to you." The voice snapped, sharper this time. Max set down his wrench and turned to see three men standing at the entrance. Razor was in the middle, flanked by two of his men. They all had smug grins plastered across their faces, the kind of grins that spell trouble. "You're Max, right?" Razor asked, stepping inside the garage. His boots crunched against the oil-stained floor. Max nodded slowly, wiping his hands on a rag. "That's me." Razor looked around the garage, his grin growing wider. "Nice little setup you got here. Must be making good money fixing cars." "I get by," Max said calmly, his voice low. "Well, you see, we're here to talk business," Razor said, his tone turning cold. "This is our neighborhood, and we make sure everyone's safe. But safety ain't free, you know." Max's jaw tightened. He knew where this was going. He'd heard stories from other shopkeepers about how Razor's gang demanded protection money. Those who refused often found their businesses trashed, or worse. "I don't need your protection," Max said firmly, looking Razor in the eye. Razor chuckled, but there was no humor in it. His men stepped closer, closing the space between them and Max. "See, that's not how it works," Razor said, his voice dripping with menace. "You either pay or things get messy." Max stared at him for a long moment. His mind raced, but his face remained calm. These men didn't know who he was, what he used to be. He had spent years in the MMA world, fighting in cages, taking down opponents twice his size. His body was scared and seasoned, his reflexes sharp. But he had left that life behind, wanting nothing more than peace. "I'm not interested," Max said finally, turning back to his work. Razor's smile vanished. He reached out and grabbed Max's arm, yanking him around. "I don't think you understand." The movement was fast, too fast for Razor to react. Max's hand shot up, gripping Razor's wrist with surprising strength. For a moment, the garage fell silent. The other two men shifted nervously. "You should leave," Max said, his voice steady but laced with warning. Razor snatched his hand away, his face a mixture of anger and confusion. He hadn't expected resistance, especially not from someone like Max. "This isn't over," Razor said, stepping back. "We'll be back, and next time, you'll wish you'd listened." Max watched as the three men left, their laughter echoing down the street. His heart was pounding, but he didn't let it show. He knew they would return, and when they did, they wouldn't come alone. That night, Max sat alone in his small apartment, staring at his scared hands. Memories of his M&A days flooded his mind. The fights, the victories, the pain. He had walked away from that world to find peace, but now it seemed that peace was slipping through his fingers. He wasn't afraid of Razor or his gang. What worried him was what he might have to do to protect himself and the neighborhood he called home. As the city slept, Max made a quiet decision. If they came back, he wouldn't run. He wouldn't hide. He would stand his ground. And this time, he wouldn't hold back. For a few days, the neighborhood was quiet. Razor's gang had vanished from sight, leaving Max to work in peace. But peace was fleeting, and Max knew it wouldn't last. Late one evening, Max was locking up his garage when he noticed a car parked down the street. It had been sitting there for hours, its windows tinted dark. Max's instincts kicked in. Years of fighting in the MMA cage had taught him to read danger before it struck. He glanced around the empty street. The air felt heavy, like a storm brewing in the distance. As Max turned to walk home, the car doors opened, and 6 men stepped out. Razor was among them, his face twisted with anger. This time, they weren't armed with bats or crowbars. They carried knives. "Evening, Max," Razor called out, his voice dripping with venom. Max stopped and turned, his broad frame silhouetted against the dim streetlights. "You sure you want to do this?" he asked calmly, his voice carrying through the quiet street. Razor sneered. "You embarrassed me. Nobody does that and gets away with it." The men spread out, surrounding Max like a pack of wolves. They moved cautiously, their confidence shaken after the last encounter. Max took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the group. He didn't want this fight, but he had no choice. The neighborhood was watching, even if the curtains and blinds were drawn. If he backed down now, Razor would win, not just against him, but against everyone who lived there. Razor nodded at one of his men. "Take him down." The man lunged, his knife flashing in the dim light. Max sidestepped, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting it hard. The knife clattered to the ground, and Max delivered a sharp elbow to the man's face, sending him to the pavement. 2 more men charged at once, their knives slashing through the air. Max ducked and weaved, his movements fluid and precise. He blocked one strike with his forearm, then spun and landed a powerful kick to the second man's stomach. Razor's anger grew as he watched his men fall one by one. "What are you waiting for?" he shouted at the others. "Get him." The remaining men hesitated. They had heard the stories now. Whispers about Max's past, about how he used to fight professionally. Seeing him in action only confirmed their fears. Max didn't wait for them to attack. He moved first, closing the distance between him and his opponents with lightning speed. His fists landed with precision, each strike calculated to disable without causing permanent harm. Within minutes, the fight was over. The men lay groaning on the ground, their knives scattered. Only Razor remained standing, his face pale and his hands trembling. Max stepped toward him, his eyes locked onto Razor's. "This ends here," Max said firmly. "No more threats. No more attacks. If you come after me, or anyone else in this neighborhood again, you'll regret it." Razor clenched his fists, his pride and fear battling for control. Finally, he spat on the ground and backed away. "You think you've won," he snarled. "This isn't over." He turned and ran, leaving his men behind. The next morning, Max sat in his garage, sipping coffee and listening to the faint sounds of life outside. The neighborhood felt different. People were walking the streets again, talking, laughing. The fear that had gripped them for so long was beginning to lift. But Max knew the fight wasn't over. Razor was dangerous, and the gang's connections ran deep. As Max looked at his scarred hands, he thought about the life he had left behind. He didn't want to fight anymore, but maybe, just maybe, this was his chance to use his skills for something bigger, for something good. For now, though, he would wait. If Razor came back, Max would be ready. The air in the neighborhood was lighter after Max's last fight with Razor's gang. For the first time in years, people walked the streets without constantly looking over their shoulders. But the victory was far from complete, and Max knew it. Razor had retreated, but he wasn't gone. Max could feel the gang's presence lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. This time, however, Max wasn't alone. Late one evening, as Max locked up his garage, he noticed a man standing nearby. He was older, wearing a tattered jacket and holding a battered toolbox. Max recognized him. It was Mr. Carter, the neighborhood's retired electrician. "You've got guts, kid," Mr. Carter said, stepping closer. Max raised an eyebrow. "Just trying to keep the peace." Carter chuckled. "Peace isn't something you keep by yourself. You need people." Max nodded slowly. He had spent years fighting alone, both in and out of the MMA cage. But Carter's words struck a chord. "You're not the only one who wants Razor gone," Carter continued. "There are others, people like me, who've been waiting for someone to stand up to them." Max leaned against the garage door, arms crossed. "And what are you saying?" "That we team up." Carter smiled. "I'm saying the neighborhood's stronger than you think. We've just been too scared to fight back. But you've given us hope." Over the next few days, Carter introduced Max to others who wanted to push back against Razor and his gang. There was Maria, the fiery owner of a small bakery who had been paying protection money for years. She was tired of living in fear and offered her shop as a safe meeting place. Then there was Jamal, a teenager who worked at the local grocery store. He had seen too many of his friends dragged into the gang's world and wanted to make a difference. Even Mrs. Alvarez, a grandmother who ran a tiny fruit stand, joined in. "I may not be strong," she said with a determined smile, "but I've got eyes and ears everywhere." Together, they formed a quiet alliance. They shared stories of what the gang had done, mapped out their movements, and began gathering evidence of their crimes. Max realized the neighborhood was more than just a collection of scared people. It was a community with untapped strength. One evening, Max gathered the group in Maria's bakery. The warm smell of fresh bread filled the air, but the mood was serious. "We need a plan," Max said, looking around the room. "Razor's not going to stop unless we hit him where it hurts." "And where's that?" Jamal asked. "His money," Max replied. "The gang makes most of it through extortion, but they're running other operations too. Drugs, stolen goods. If we can disrupt that, we weaken them." Carter nodded. "I've seen them using that old warehouse by the docks. They've got trucks coming and going late at night. Could be worth checking out." Max's mind raced with possibilities. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for all of them. The next night, Max and Jamal crept toward the warehouse Carter had mentioned. Jamal carried a small camera, determined to document whatever they found. Through a crack in the warehouse door, they saw men loading crates into trucks. The crates were packed with drugs and stolen electronics. Razor was there, barking orders, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "This is it," Max whispered. "This is how we bring them down." When they returned to the bakery, the group gathered around to see the photos and videos Jamal had taken. Maria's face hardened. "This is enough to go to the police," she said. But Max wasn't convinced. "The police might be too slow," he said. "If we tip them off now, Razor could disappear before they act. We need to be smart about this." As the group strategized, Max realized how much the neighborhood had changed. The fear that once gripped these people was turning into determination. They weren't just victims anymore. They were fighters. For the first time, Max felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. The fight was far from over, but he wasn't alone anymore. The neighborhood was with him, and together, they were ready to take on whatever came next. The neighborhood alliance had grown stronger in the days following Max and Jamal's discovery at the warehouse. People who once stayed silent were now speaking out. Carter, Maria, and the others spread the word carefully, making sure the community was ready to act when the time came. But Razor wasn't sitting idle. He had noticed the shift in the neighborhood. The stolen glances, the sudden courage in people's eyes. He knew Max was behind it all, and it infuriated him. Max had humiliated him, broken his crew, And now, the neighborhood seemed to be slipping from his grip. Razor wouldn't let that happen. Late one night, Max sat in his small apartment, going over the group's plans. They were close to gathering enough evidence to shut down Razor's operations for good. But as he reviewed Jamal's footage, a sharp knock on the door startled him. Max stood, his muscles tensing. He approached the door cautiously, his mind racing. When he opened it, Maria stood there, her face pale and her hands trembling. "They hit the bakery," she said, her voice shaking. Max's heart sank. "What happened?" "They smashed everything," Maria said. "The ovens, the shelves. They even broke the windows. They left a message. Max." She held up a crumpled piece of paper. Max unfolded it and read the scrawled words, "You're next." The next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing with anger. Word of the attack on Maria's bakery spread quickly. People gathered outside her shop, staring at the shattered windows and the graffiti on the walls. Max stood in the middle of the crowd, his jaw clenched. This wasn't just a warning, it was a declaration of war. "They're trying to scare us," Carter said, standing beside Max. "They think this will break us." "They're wrong," Max replied, his voice steady. "This just proves we're getting to them." As night fell, Max knew Razor wouldn't stop at the bakery. The gang was desperate, and desperate people were dangerous. He stayed late at the garage, preparing for what he knew was coming. He reinforced the doors and cleared the workspace, turning it into a makeshift arena. If Razor wanted a fight, Max would give him one. Around midnight, the sound of engines roared through the streets. Max looked up from his work, his eyes narrowing. He stepped outside and saw 3 cars screech to a halt in front of the garage. Razor stepped out first, his face twisted with rage. Behind him were 8 men, all armed with bats, chains, and knives. "This ends tonight," Razor growled, pointing at Max. "You think you can turn my neighborhood against me? You think you can win?" Max stepped forward, his broad frame illuminated by the flickering streetlights. "This was never your neighborhood," he said calmly. "It belongs to the people." Razor's men spread out, circling Max, but this time Max wasn't alone. From the shadows, Carter, Jamal, and several other neighbors stepped forward. They carried makeshift weapons, wooden planks, pipes, and anything they could find. Maria stood among them, her face determined despite the fear in her eyes. "This ends tonight," Max repeated, his voice echoing through the street. The fight erupted with a ferocity that shook the neighborhood. Razor's men charged, but Max was ready. He moved with precision, taking down one opponent after another. The neighbors fought back too, their fear replaced by courage. Carter swung a pipe, fending off 2 gang members. Maria threw a heavy bag of flour, temporarily blinding another. Jamal dodged a swing and tackled a thug to the ground. Razor watched in disbelief as his crew faltered. This wasn't the weak, frightened neighborhood he had terrorized for years. This was a united front, and they were winning. As the chaos unfolded, Razor made a move toward Max, swinging a chain wildly. Max dodged, the chain narrowly missing his head. "Still think you can scare me?" Max asked, his voice steady as he countered with a punch that sent Razor staggering. Razor roared in frustration, charging again. But Max was quicker, blocking the attack and delivering a series of strikes that left Razor on the ground, gasping for air. When the dust settled, Razor's men were either unconscious or fleeing. The neighbors stood together, battered but victorious. Max looked down at Razor, who was clutching his ribs and glaring up at him. "This is over," Max said. "If I see you or your gang here again, you won't walk away next time." Razor didn't reply. He struggled to his feet and stumbled to one of the cars, disappearing into the night. The neighborhood was silent as the group looked around at what they had accomplished. Slowly, smiles began to spread. They had stood up to the gang, and they had won. For the first time in years, the streets felt like they belonged to the people again. The days following Razor's defeat were filled with cautious optimism. The neighborhood was quieter, the streets safer, but Max knew better than to celebrate too soon. Razor might have retreated, but someone had been funding and organizing his operations. Razor wasn't smart enough to run things on his own. Max had seen it in the warehouse. Too many resources, too much coordination. There was someone higher up the chain, someone who had a lot more to lose. One evening, while Max was reviewing Jamal's footage from the warehouse, Carter walked into the garage, carrying a folder. "You were right," Carter said, dropping the folder on a workbench. "Razor's just a pawn." Max opened the folder, flipping through photos and documents. Carter had been digging into public records, talking to people in the neighborhood, and piecing together a trail. At the center of it all was a man named Victor Kane, a wealthy businessman with a spotless public image. He owned several properties in the city, including the warehouse by the docks. "Victor Kane," Max murmured, studying a photo of the man. He was sharply dressed, with slicked back hair and a cold smile. "Kane's been pulling the strings," Carter said. "He funds the gang, handles the money, and keeps his hands clean. That's why the cops haven't touched him." Max clenched his fists. "If we take him down, the whole operation falls apart." Max and the group decided to act quickly. Jamal, with his sharp eye for detail, tracked Kane's movements, finding out where he lived and worked. Maria and Carter used their network of neighbors to gather more intel. The pieces began to fall into place. Kane had regular meetings at a high-end nightclub in the city, where he discussed business with his associates. The Neighborhood Alliance decided it was time to confront him directly. The following night, Max and Carter drove to the nightclub. It was a sleek, neon-lit building buzzing with music and laughter. Max, dressed in dark clothes, blended into the shadows as they waited for Kane to leave. Around midnight, Kane emerged, flanked by 2 bodyguards. He walked with the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. Max stepped out of the shadows, his broad figure blocking Kane's path. "Victor Kane," Max said, his voice calm but firm. Kane stopped, his smile fading as he sized up the man before him. "Do I know you?" "You know my neighborhood," Max replied. "You've been bleeding it dry for years." Kane chuckled, though there was a nervous edge to it. "I don't know what you're talking about. Now, if you'll excuse me." Max stepped closer, his presence intimidating. "This ends now," he said. "Razor's finished. The neighborhood is fighting back. You've got nowhere to hide." Kane's expression hardened. "You think you can threaten me? I own half this city." Max smirked. "Maybe, but you don't own us." Before Kane could respond, Jamal stepped forward with a camera. He had been recording the entire exchange. "Smile for the camera," Jamal said. "This footage is going to show everyone who you really are." Kane's composure cracked. "You're making a mistake," he hissed. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." "Neither do you," Max said. "But you're about to find out." The confrontation sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. The footage Jamal captured, combined with the evidence the group had collected, was enough to bring Kane's operations to light. The Neighborhood Alliance worked together to get the evidence to the right people: local journalists, community leaders, and even some honest cops who wanted to see justice done. As the story spread, Kane's power began to crumble. His connections abandoned him, his properties were raided, and his name was dragged through the mud. Back in the neighborhood, the victory felt real for the first time. People walked the streets without fear, knowing that the man who had controlled their lives from the shadows was finally exposed. Max stood in the center of it all, watching as the community he had fought to protect began to heal. But he knew there was one final chapter left. Razor was still out there, and Max wasn't about to leave any loose ends. The neighborhood was finally breathing free. Victor Kane's fall had shattered the gang's grip, and people were reclaiming their streets. But Max knew the battle wasn't over. Razor was still out there, wounded but dangerous, and Max had no doubt he would return for revenge. Late one evening, as Max worked in his garage, Carter arrived with news. "He's back," Carter said, his voice heavy with concern. Max turned to face him. "Razor?" Carter nodded. "Spotted near the docks. Word is, he's trying to pull together what's left of his crew. He's desperate, Max, and desperate men are reckless." Max nodded slowly. "Then it's time to finish this." The docks were eerily quiet when Max arrived that night. The air was thick with fog, and the sound of waves lapping against the pier filled the silence. Max moved carefully, his eyes scanning the shadows. He didn't have to wait long. Razor stepped out from behind a stack of crates, his face twisted with anger. He was flanked by a handful of his remaining men, all armed and ready for a fight. "I told you this wasn't over," Razor growled, his voice echoing in the empty space. Max stood his ground, his broad shoulders squared. "You've already lost," he said calmly. "Kane's gone. The neighborhood isn't afraid of you anymore. It's over, Razor. Walk away." But Razor shook his head, his hands clenched into fists. "You don't get to decide when it's over," he spat. "You think you can take everything from me and just walk away? No, tonight. I take it back." Razor's men moved first, charging at Max with weapons raised. Max met them head-on, his years of MMA training kicking in. The fight was brutal. Max dodged a swing from a crowbar, countering with a powerful punch that sent one man sprawling. Another came at him with a knife, but Max caught his wrist, twisting it until the weapon fell to the ground. Despite their numbers, Razor's men were no match for Max's skill and determination. One by one, they fell, groaning on the ground or scrambling to escape. Finally, it was just Max and Razor. Razor picked up a steel pipe, his grip tight as he circled Max. "You're a dead man," he hissed. Max didn't reply. He simply watched, waiting for Razor to make his move. With a roar, Razor lunged, swinging the pipe with all his strength. Max ducked, the pipe whooshing past his head. He countered with a quick jab to Razor's ribs, followed by a hook that knocked the pipe from his hands. Razor stumbled but didn't back down. He charged again, his fists flying wildly. Max blocked each punch with ease, his movements calculated and precise. "You're done, Razor," Max said as he delivered a powerful uppercut that sent Razor crashing to the ground. Razor lay there, gasping for air, his face bloodied and his spirit broken. Max stood over him, his voice calm but firm. "You don't own this neighborhood anymore. Stay away, or next time, you won't get back up." For a moment, Razor said nothing. Then, with a groan, he rolled onto his side and spat out, "You'll regret this." Max didn't flinch. "No, I won't. But you will." The police arrived shortly after, tipped off by Carter and the others who had been watching from a safe distance. Razor and his men were hauled away, their reign of terror finally brought to an end. As dawn broke over the neighborhood, Max walked home, his steps heavy but steady. He passed by the bakery, where Maria was already opening for the morning. She waved, her smile warm and grateful. The streets were quiet, but it was a peaceful quiet, the kind that comes after a storm. Max knew his work wasn't finished. The scars the gang had left would take time to heal, but the neighborhood was strong, stronger than he had ever imagined. For the first time in years, Max felt at peace. He had found a purpose beyond fighting, a purpose in protecting, in building, in standing with his community. And as the sun rose higher, casting light on the once shadowed streets, Max knew one thing for certain: the neighborhood's future was brighter than ever.